Okay.
Cool. So awesome. Um, yeah. So tomorrow is, I guess, tomorrow's Indigenous Peoples Day, and the purpose of this uh, call was I just want to bring some awareness to it. It's been, at least in my eyes, more and more celebrated over the last couple of years, and I would venture to bet that some people still don't know exactly what it is or why we celebrate it or why the shift towards Indigenous Peoples Day has happened. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge it and talk about it. And so, yeah, we'll just
That sounds great.
riff and have fun. So, in your eyes, what is Indigenous Peoples Day?
Absolutely. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself first. My
Mhm.
name is Sarah Adams. I'm a proud Choctaw woman, and normally I introduce myself in my language, and I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah.
Um, so Halito, Saho Chippewa, Sarah Adams, Choctaw Hoyosia, so Ishkiat Tammy Adams, Sapotniat, Dorothy Jefferson, Oklahoma City, Atali. So hello, my name is Sarah Adams. I am a proud Choctaw woman. I'm the first daughter of Tammy Adams and the granddaughter of Dorothy Jefferson. I live here in Oklahoma City. So excited to really talk about Indigenous Peoples Day and
Mhm.
why it is important and why we should be talking about it. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to just kind of, dig into it a little bit. And you're right. It's definitely picked up some more media. It's starting to really domino effect into other parts of the country. And it really got its start in California, quite honestly. In 92, Berkeley celebrated the first Indigenous Peoples Day. And then even before that, in 1977, at a UN conference, the idea about celebrating Indigenous peoples really started to spark. So the very first roots of it really were at this UN conference, and then California kind of caught on to that. And then from there, more states started to participate. And I'm in Oklahoma,
Mhm.
and we asked to see it happen for about 4 years in a row before it actually happened. So there was a lot of work to try to get from celebrating Columbus Day to an Indigenous
Mhm.
Peoples Day. And I think, part of the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day is this opportunity as a community to be able to talk about the complexities around our holidays in general, like
Mhm.
thinking critically about the legacy of Columbus. So, I think most of us had this very, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue,
Right.
and we're fed this story about discovery, right? And it wasn't
Mhm.
discovery. Like, we know there were millions of people living on this land base when Columbus arrived, and that story is really a story of exploitation. It's not a story of, all of these kind of romanticized myths that we were taught about, oh, partnerships between Spain and indigenous people and what that looked like. It was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. It was the beginning of what we know as, you know, um, just a lot of things that we still deal with today, as far as human trafficking, as far as enslavement, what we deal with as oppression, people of color. A lot of that has its roots in that story as well. And so it's important for us to kind of go, okay, what did we learn? What didn't we learn? Where are the gaps? What information do we maybe need to fill in there to have a complete understanding of what that was? And is that worthy of a celebration, or celebrating this person? And the answer by and large should be no. Like, certainly we should know about it. Certainly we should
Right.
learn about it. But maybe the celebration needs to be turned around to talk about the resilience of Indigenous people and what they offer to our communities. And so that's really been an exciting thing to do in our communities, to be like, hey, a lot of people think of us as people of the past, we're not, like we are contributing in so many ways to the culture, to commerce, to ecological knowledge systems, to education. And it's an exciting thing to talk about, and Indigenous Peoples Day offers us kind of this lane to do that.
Right. So I like how it wasn't completely, so and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the idea to push Indigenous Peoples Day wasn't to shut down Columbus Day. It was more like re-education and shifting the focus on the people that was almost, well, absolutely oppressed during the Columbus time. So it was, um, did I get that right? Where it's not,
Well, I would say that
this is
we certainly don't want to celebrate Columbus. Like I don't
right.
want
Oh
to
yeah.
be misunderstood that, but I don't think many people were celebrating Columbus anyway. Like it wasn't this
Right.
thing. People were like holding, you know what I mean? Like it
Yeah.
wasn't a thing. But what I think is important is that it is still a holiday, and
Right.
whenever we have to, and that's with anything, right? Like when we're thinking
Mhm.
critically around like Thanksgiving, right? Like
Right.
also another opportunity for us to kind of pull that apart and be like, okay, what's the real story? What
Mhm.
really happened? Was it this very romanticized version of this partnership between the Pilgrims and the Indigenous people? And it
Mhm.
absolutely was not, so
Right.
it's this opportunity for us to go, when we know better, we have to do better. We
Mhm.
have this opportunity as citizens to become more well-rounded, to not just um, talk truthfully and accurately about history, but have this opportunity to teach the next generations, so that they don't also perpetuate these myths that are very much steeped in racism and white colonialism and patriarchy. And so it's a great time for knowledge, for celebration of Indigenous cultures and people. And it's really this opportunity too to be like, whose land am I on? Right? Like this
Right.
was all Indigenous land. So where am I living? Who was displaced for me to be here? And what is my responsibility as someone who is living on this land?
Mhm. I was doing some research on just the native tribes in America, and I mean, there's what, over 500 and something tribes across the country, and
Mhm.
just in Arizona, there's something like 25 tribes. I mean, I've heard of maybe 10 of them, and
Mhm.
and that's Arizona, and I can't imagine the rest of the 47 continental states where there's just, it is interesting. I mean, I didn't think there was 500. I mean, that's a lot
It
of
is.
tribes that I don't think a lot of people understand.
No, and then what's really beautiful about that intertribal diversity is that every tribe has a different language, has a different regalia, has different creation stories. They have different customs and ways, and it's like, man, this is a really cool time to be thinking about like the complexities of the tribes. The fact that we have these super complex government systems that were actually what we have in the United States now is based on what Indigenous people had created before the United States was the United States. Like it's based on our governments. And even I'm in Oklahoma,
Mhm.
they took tribal governments and they based our state constitution off of that constitution, but they did remove some rights about women from it before they made it a state
Great.
constitution. Of course, like thanks
Of
so
course they
much.
did.
Thanks, Oklahoma. But it was largely based on knowledge systems from Indigenous people. And you'll find that in a lot of things that we just don't talk about it, whether we're talking about knowledge systems, the numerical system. The number zero is an Indigenous thought process and
Huh.
knowledge system. When we're talking about ecological systems and biodiversity, all of those knowledge systems have the roots in Indigenous ways and knowledge. Now, it's always been um, really handed back to Western academia to kind of be like, oh, this is this is, you know, what we're going to deem as reputable knowledge. But
Mhm.
even now we see this reclamation of space and knowledge to say, wow, you know, there are all of these very old ways of healing, learning, knowing, um, that are really, really incredible, that have always been around. We're just now giving the space to let that be honestly legal. I mean,
Right.
it wasn't until 1978 that Indigenous people had the right to sing their songs, speak their language, practice their religious ways legally. Like if you did that before 78, you could be arrested and taken to jail. And so I was born in 78, so I feel
Yeah.
like my generation is actually the first generation to be have the opportunity to be fully Indigenous without going to jail. And that's just pretty contemporary, right? Like, so we think of
Yeah.
this like so long ago, and it's not. It's
Right.
really recent.
Right. And in terms of Native Americans living on this land, I mean, what has it been? Thousands of years? I mean,
More than that. Yeah, like
right.
and every tribe has different stories about that, right? So
Mhm.
Choctaw people, our creation story is that we came from this mound, which is still there in Mississippi called Nanawaya. And it was different tribes. A lot of them have creation stories that either originate in the earth or
Mhm.
originate from the stars. And so we're mound people, and we believe that we came from the earth, and we were the last people to come out of the earth through this mountain, through this cave, because we loved our mother so much. And so even in this creation story,
Mhm.
you can understand like the tie that the earth is our mother, and what you know, tighter bond do you have than coming from the womb of your mother. It gives you an understanding of how we feel about the earth. It gives you an understanding about like the connection, that it isn't just this thing that we revolve on, and you know, it is part of our of who we are. Like it
Mhm.
makes up part of who we are. So I think even in like learning creation stories about people, you're able to understand their value systems better, and each tribe has a different creation story.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
It's I love that. The uh I've met a lot of people that have kind of been uh especially in my religious circles, they're like, "Well, we can't listen to those stories. You know, our story is right." And it's interesting to hear that like every tribe has a whole different story, and it, I think it's a little bonkers to think that one person is right and everybody is wrong. I mean, it's
Right.
I
Yeah.
uh I love that. So,
There has to be space for all of us, right?
yeah.
Like there has to be space for everyone. And I think that's the beautiful part of it, quite honestly, is like there is beauty in diversity. There is beauty in difference. You know, if we have the capacity and the heart and the kindness within us to say, yeah, like I appreciate that you feel that way. And I'm happy that you feel this joy and love about where you believe you came from. And if we
Mhm.
could all do that, like, wow, wouldn't that be a make this a better place?
Yeah. I mean, it's we only grow with different opinions and getting together. And so, is there any? So, I want to talk about a couple of different. I want to talk about one, the good things about what Native Americans have done and are continuing to doing. But then I would also love to touch on the struggles
Mhm.
that you are going through, and just the day-to-day challenges that I think that most people probably don't think about. So uh, we'll start with the goods. Is there anything that you want to add on of like the celebration? How could I, as an extremely white person, I have no native in my blood, I did a DNA test, there's nothing there, um, but how could I help in a way where, kind of like as we talked about, not being a performative ally, but being a true ally? Is there a way? What's the best way for me to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, in your opinion?
I love that question. Um, I think there's so many different ways to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day in a way that honors Indigenous people, right? Like, I
Mhm.
think this whole day is about learning. It's about collaboration. It's about exchange. And in that vein, I would say one of the best things that you can do on Indigenous Peoples Day is to listen, right? Because you will find every city has probably something happening or opportunities to go and learn. And
Mhm.
so I would find out, one, whose land are you on? You know, who was here before this became the United States, before it became you know, excuse me, before Arizona became a state? Who was here? What were they doing? How did they live? So that you understand the sacrifices that it takes, that a people had to take for the United States to become a place, right?
Mhm.
And that it happened unwillingly, that this was not a thing that they were like, oh, okay, let's do this, you know? And so understanding that history around where you live, I think is a great first place to start. Next, I think the important thing to do is to remember to use your platform, whatever platform you have of privilege, to hand that mic over to an Indigenous person to talk about the issues that their community is facing. So we all have privileged platforms. I have them, you have them, everybody has them, whether it means you know, you have a podcast, or maybe there's a group of friends that you meet with and you get together and you know, whatever platform you have, use that to not speak for those people, but to hand the mic to them because they have their own
Mhm.
stories to tell. One thing that drives me nuts is when people say, I want to speak on behalf of, or I want to, you know, it's like they've got
Right.
their own voices, their own stories, and anything less than
Yeah.
giving them that opportunity is performative.
Mhm.
Because we do have our own voices and we want to use them. We just need the space to do that. I think another great thing to do is to learn about how Indigenous people are living in contemporary lives and contributing to your state and your community. So, most Indigenous tribes contribute mass amounts of money to the state, and they don't have to do that. Like, they provide health care to a lot of non-Indigenous people. They help pave your roads, they help fund your schools, they help in a lot of ways that you probably don't even know that are happening. And that's because of the tribal commerce and the money that they're bringing in as a tribe.
Mhm.
um, I think also dispelling myths about Indigenous people and being open to think critically about maybe information you were taught in school that might not be accurate, and being
Mhm.
open to have a conversation about, like, hey, like, so I was taught that, you know, A, B, and C. Is this something that, you know, that resonates with you as an Indigenous person, or is there something else I need to look at? I think it's a great time to do things like that. And again, just being a willing, listening, open-hearted person to your Indigenous relations around you and neighbors is a great place to start, and to also not expect any Indigenous person to do your work for you. Like, that's
Mhm.
your job to do your own research. To Google has just about everything you need.
Right.
So there, don't expect to, and don't tokenize Indigenous people to be like, hey, I need you to tell me about A, B, and C.
Right.
But it is certainly an opportunity to learn things, because people on Indigenous Peoples Day, by and large, are offering that
Mhm.
opportunity.
Oh, good. I like that. Okay. Um, you touched on a little bit of what did you say? Like today's what you bring in to today's world, because it's not a, you know, indigenous people aren't people of the past, as you said. Like you guys, like they're around today. Like there are 500 tribes. There are I think 2.5 million people was the census data that I pulled up earlier today. And at least here in Arizona, there's no doubt that there are struggles and I guess problems within. We have reservation land right outside of the 101, which is a highway here. And if you're, I don't know if you've ever flown into Phoenix, but as the plane takes off, if you head east, you can see a clear division line between Scottsdale and the reservation land. And I reached out to one of my Native friends, and I said, "What are some good questions that I could ask?" And she wanted me to ask you about um, access to education on alcohol and drug addiction.
Yeah,
That from even the little that I know that is a a big problem. And from what she was saying this morning, is there's not really a lot of help there that
mhm,
you would find for like someone, my privilege. I'd be able to find the resources and everything, and it sounds like that's not there. So is there, what does that look like in today's world, and what could be the next steps to making to leveling that playing field?
sure. It's a great question. And I don't ever pretend to know what any specific community is facing. And I
Mm.
can only tell you about what I know and what I've experienced here, again, living in Oklahoma and not being in Arizona.
Right,
But
right.
by and large, there are a lot of there's going to be access issues for any community of color or any community that is suffering from oppression, whether it be the 2S LGBTQ community, whether we're talking about the brown and black communities, whether we're talking about disabled communities. Oppression is a part of that system that keeps that community oppressed, right? Like, I
Mm,
think we have to back up a little bit before we talk about access and
mm,
talk about the systemic nature of racism and the systemic nature of oppression, that this country was certainly built upon the ideas that supported manifest destiny, which as a church, I think it's important that people of that church take a really hard look about how Christianity contributed to the oppression of pretty much anybody who isn't a white male.
right.
Because of manifest destiny and it being a law that said, you can go to a place that isn't Christianized, and if those people are also not Christian, you can claim it in the name of your sovereign, whoever, whatever country you came from. You come back to that country, and then you can claim it and it becomes yours.
Right.
And so this thought process that anybody who wasn't a Christian male, not having the right to even be a free person in that space is kind of the roots of how we arrived here. So then when we see that in America through, I call it the little brother of manifest destiny, which is the doctrine of discovery, is that first big through the papal bulls that came through that said if you weren't a Christian
Mm,
and you could claim that land. But manifest destiny in the United States is kind of the little brother of that, which opened up westward expansion. And I know you didn't ask this question, but I think it's important for us to go back and say, where
absolutely.
did
Yeah,
it
yeah.
come from? Why does it exist? Why are we still dealing with it like
Mhm,
hundreds of years later? And the answer is because those systems um, were actually brought into law in about 1860 something through the federal government, through Congress, who cited um, the doctrine of discovery to say, well, based on this, indigenous people can be removed from their land. And that is like the base of how oppression happened in our country, right? So if
mm,
you were not a white male, you were not deemed a full person, and everybody other than that was seen as either property or a percentage of a human. And so since that time, we have had to all work. If you weren't a white male, you had to work for your humanhood
mhm,
and to come up to just level playing ground. Well, as we know, that doesn't happen quickly because there is a power structure that keeps that from happening, right? If you're not a full
right,
person, you have to fight for those rights to get to that place to just be level. And that
right.
didn't happen here for a long time. So when we understand and connect the dots that that this struggle has been happening in our country since it became a country, it's easy to understand that there within any community, access has been an issue from the jump, like
Mm,
from the jump, whether you're talking about healthcare or food systems or voting rights or access to voting, to education, to accuracy of education. They all work together. And so, and that's why it's so hard to break away from these systems. And the things that we see, like alcoholism and drug addiction and abuse and things like that, those are all the fallout from oppression, right? So understanding that this doesn't happen to communities of color because of who they are, it's because they're within systems of oppression. Those are all byproducts of oppression. So understanding that is a huge piece of understanding why we struggle with what we struggle with. Because I think if you don't understand that, people are by and large going, well, like if they didn't work hard enough, or they didn't, we hear that a lot,
Right.
like you just got to pull yourself up by your
Yeah.
bootstraps. What
Get
if you
the
don't have bootstraps?
yeah. Kind of hard when
What?
someone took your boots away.
Yes, like, well, if you would just, make better decisions. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it's nice to have decisions to make.
Mhm.
Sometimes we don't have as many options as other people because of the situations that we're in. And
Mhm.
so I think that's a pivotal piece to understand before you talk about the ills that are within a community. So absolutely, poverty is a huge thing.
Mhm.
And when you don't have access to healthcare or mental health care, and you see things like alcohol and drug addiction, because those are much easier to access than healthcare,
Right.
right? Like the reason
Right.
it happens is like there isn't anybody on the planet that's like, I'd really like to be a drug addict. It's because you
Right.
don't have access to the other tools
Mhm.
to to circumvent that. We all want healthcare, but we also want it in a culturally relevant way. Like
Mhm.
prior to colonialism, within our culture, we had healing practices, we had traditions, we had all of these things built within our culture that were healing, that gave autonomy to our women, two-spirit, and non-binary people. We recognize many different genders. We had this sense of community. We lived tribally, communally, so
Mhm.
that there wasn't somebody who was on the outs that was suffering. If you're a part of our community, you're a part of our community. It doesn't matter, whose family you are a part of. We have incredibly just incredible systems of kinship within the
Mhm.
Indigenous community. And because of the way we lived, there was no poverty. There weren't these things, because we all survived together, and
Mhm.
we did things in a way that was about community health, and also looking at what are the values of a community, right? So if your value is money and wealth, well then that's one thing, but that's not what it was for us. Our
Mhm.
value was community health, and if that's the value, then that's what you're working towards. So pre-colonization, we had all of these very complex kinship systems that we were not women who were seen as sexual objects. Choctaw women did not wear shirts. Like we were in these hide skirts, and we were not sexualized, nor were we sexually abused. Not to say any community is perfect, that's not what I'm saying, but it isn't the problem we have today, like MMIW, where you see
Mhm.
more than half of Indigenous women will be abused in their lifetime. And the majority of those people abusing us are non-Indigenous people. And so it's like, how did we get from here to here? Well, it's because we're not seen as fully human people.
Mhm.
MMIW, which stands for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, is a crisis in Indian country right now. We are being trafficked. We are being murdered at rates that are so much higher than any other group of people on the planet. We are being incarcerated at really high rates. And all of these structures impact our family, right? Like when you don't have a
Mhm.
mom that's there or who has been pulled from the family, I mean, we all know what happens. It's hard. It makes it even
Yeah.
harder. There are laws that are being policy that are happening now and from state to state and on a federal level to help address that, but it's not happening fast enough. And so like we're seeing this really exciting time in Indigenous communities of this reclamation of matriarchal leadership that is very much based in community, that is very much grassroots, that's about trying to fill in the gaps of a system that was not ever meant to protect us, that isn't protecting us.
Right.
Uh, we come together. I have a nonprofit called Matriarch, and we meet twice a month, and we learn about a different topic that impacts our people. Then we brainstorm about what we're going to do about that. Then we go do it. And it's that kind of work that I'm seeing pop up everywhere now. It's just happening everywhere. And it is so beautiful that we always had these ways and this knowledge, but we're rediscovering it and we're making it evolve to serve us in the way that we need now, because Indigenous people have always been an evolving people, and that's what makes us so resilient.
Right. Now my Zoom is yelling at me, so I'm just going to. Well, I'm having a phenomenal conversation. I want to keep this going. I just don't want Zoom to like kick me out, so I'm quickly
Sure.
gonna check something.
Yeah.
So I've got a lot more that I want to like jump into. I should be. Am I not? I'll sign in. Let's try that. That's not even close. I love technology because half time it works and half time it's like, oh yeah, no, you're not logged in, so it's not gonna
You're
work.
like, no, you can't have this.
Thanks.
Right.
Yeah, you can't
But I
can't
think
have
it's a
nice
really
things.
great question. And I think that there's,
Mhm.
what your friend mentioned about access is
Right.
incredibly important. So if you live and I will say that the complexities of Indigenous living, some of us are urban Indigenous people, some of us are reservation, some of us are rural. Like we're all in different places. And so
Hmm.
the question about access or things that are impacting us negatively can vary a lot in one state. So I
Yeah.
live in the city and I'm near IHS clinics, and I'm near, but I don't live near my tribal nation, which is about 4 hours away. So I can't get all of the resources from my tribe. So I feel like as an urban Indigenous person, I'm separated from a lot of the culture, like language classes and
Hmm.
things like that. But I do have access to like healthcare because I'm in the city, and
Right.
programs.
The do you so oh cool. We just got unlimited minutes. Thanks, Zoom.
Boom.
Nice. Uh cool. Okay. Well, let's hope it just works on here. Um as so man, I've got so many questions I want to touch on. So I want to talk a little bit about um I've got two things that are bouncing in my head right now, and one is the healthcare part. And so I want to talk about like the last 2 years. It's impossible to ignore COVID and what impact it probably did have. But then also um, whether or not over the last whether 2 years or just X amount of time in general, things that are lost that you don't think we would ever get back, that were either taken from us or um, not taken or just kind of just lost to time. I've got a friend who grew up in Toronto, and in college she learned the local language, and I cannot pronounce it to save my life, but the local language of the tribe surrounding Toronto, Canada. And this was back in like 2015, and there was only about 2 to 3,000 people in the world that spoke that language. She's not fluent by any means, but she learned it a little bit. And I was talking to her a couple weeks ago, and she said COVID wiped out a lot of the communication between people, and she can't really find anyone to even practice the language with anymore because it's just things have gone away. So I'll let you answer however that makes sense between COVID and then also the larger picture of things that are lost that we might not ever be able to get back. That was uh, good. That would have been nice to learn from natives.
Yeah. I think the question about how COVID
Hmm.
has impacted Indigenous communities is a really good one. Um, it certainly impacted our communities. We had high rates of infection as well as high rates of death in our
Hmm.
communities because of access to clean water in some instances, to access to healthcare, vaccines, um, misinformation around vaccines. And so there was a lot happening. As far as like culturally, a lot of us felt a huge hole because so many of our traditions and the special times and
Hmm.
celebrations, even mourning, happen together in groups where that's the core of it. That's how we really thrive is together, and we weren't able to do that.
Hmm.
Our dances, our traditions, our powwows, our cultural classes, our language classes, a lot of those took a big hit because we weren't able to gather. I
Hmm.
will say many of our tribes did an incredible job of doing their best, just like lots of other groups did, of trying to digitize, trying
Hmm.
to
Oh.
um, give opportunities to learn online. Some of our tribes have had for years their tribal language classes online to offer more access to their tribal citizens that might live in other states or might
Hmm.
live in places where they can't visit the community center. And so we saw those things really become robust, especially because of a lot of dollars that came into tribes through ARPA
Hmm.
funds or whatever. um, there was this opportunity for us to go, okay, how do we best preserve, how do we best continue on to thrive as Indigenous people culturally in an epidemic? What does that look
Hmm.
like? Well, it also means evolution, just like anything else. When we talk
Right.
about old ways of our people, that is beautiful and glorious, and thank goodness that they had the fortitude to be able to survive what they had to survive, and at the same time making sure that our cultural ways survive. But
Hmm.
they evolved to meet the needs of that people, and so we will continue to do that, right? Like, there are things now that I think our people, I don't think they'd be sad about it. I think they'd be like, wow, that's keen. Like, who knew you could do that with our with our cultural ways? I think they'd
Right.
be proud of us, to know that we have met the needs of our people to continue on in a way that honors our past, but continues to offer access to more people.
Hmm.
And that's pretty beautiful. I think that something that was more, that has been, when we talk about uh, things that have hurt us culturally as a people, were the boarding schools. I mean, when we are talking about, and again, this is another place where I implore Christian communities to dig in, because
Hmm.
most of those schools were run by Christian churches, organizations, also the government, also
Right.
Catholic churches. And they were horrible, horrible places of assimilation and abuse for Indigenous children.
Hmm.
My grandparents attended a boarding school in Oklahoma called Goodland that was run by Presbyterian missionaries, and it still exists today as like a boys' home. But my grandfather was 5, only spoke Choctaw, and wasn't allowed to speak his language. So you can imagine what it would be like as a 5-year-old child to not be able to communicate. They
Right.
cut their hair, and hair, and for many tribes, is only cut when someone close to you dies. So the confusion of like, who died,
Hmm.
and I can't communicate with anybody, and where are my parents, and like,
Hmm.
what is happening to me? That's a trauma filled experience. They're called boarding schools, but education was not the foremost goal of those institutions. It was assimilation. So we saw culture lost. My grandmother was not, her father didn't want her to learn her language because she wanted, at that time, there were signs in the community that said no dogs or Indians allowed. And so if you could pass as white,
Hmm.
wow, that's a much easier way to do it, not knowing the fallout that it would have on future generations to not teach the language or the culture or the tradition.
Right.
But as a parent now, I have to admit, I might do the same thing if I was faced with what kind of a life is my child going to live
Mhm.
if they can't survive the world, the outside world. Um, and so, as far as like losing culture, boarding schools were horrible. They were horrible. They were places to survive. And yes, some of our elders have talk about, well, they were 3 square meals and there was an education and it offered this or that. And I'm so glad for that. But by and large, the experience was not a positive one. And
Mhm.
we have to honor those voices of those boarding school survivors who were able to make it through. And the fact that boarding schools had graveyards, like what school do you know has a graveyard,
Right.
because so many of them tried to run away. Um, and there were experiments that happened that the government sanctioned, like, what happens if you keep vitamin D from a child, so they would do experiments on the kids there too. And a lot of the data that we have that we know is like FDA stuff came from some of
Yeah.
those experiments. So loss of
Sure.
culture, I would say we've got to talk about boarding schools if we want to address that in a way that respects the community.
Yeah. The Back in probably your grandfather's day, the idea of mental health wasn't prominent. I know it's definitely taken more of a front seat in the last couple of years, and I love that. And I'm really grateful for that. Um, what mental trauma? Because we talk about generational and systemic. What systemic kind of mental trauma has been carried from those generations, and is there a way to fix it? Even if it's not an easy way, is there a way where 2, 3 generations down the line, there's not as much pain as what, our generation might be feeling?
Generational trauma is absolutely healable. It is because we're doing it. Like we're
Mhm,
doing it. We're doing the hard work to heal that trauma, and that can be felt for generations. And it actually, like, there's scientific proof now that shows that it actually impacts your DNA, like the actual
mm,
building blocks of who you are physically are impacted by trauma. And
mm,
so it's important for us to address it. It's important for us to also create safe spaces to do that trauma healing, right? Because you can't
mhm.
heal it if you can't name it, right? And we have to
Right.
be able to understand it and do that in a space that is free from victim blaming, free
Mm,
to experience the highs and lows that come with trauma healing, and that offer like culturally relevant knowledge to that isn't Western based, that helps us
mm,
go, okay. So for example, if your parent went to a boarding school and they
mhm,
were never hugged and they were never shown physical affection and they were never told that they were loved, and then you grow up in a household where you don't receive that, and you
mhm,
internalize it as there's something wrong with me, I'm not, why won't they hug me, why won't they tell me they're proud of me? It's because they never learned how to do that, they were never taught that. And so when you can deconstruct that and go, okay, it's not because there's something wrong with me, it's because of how they grew up. There is this, I mean, it's phenomenal, it is foundational to
mhm,
understanding, to being able to forgive, to be able to process, and to be able to like lay it down and
mhm,
go, this isn't about me. This isn't about me not being good enough or lovable enough or whatever it is. But that takes time. And let me tell you, it's also not linear. It's not like a straight line to healing. Like we go up,
right.
we go back, we go down, but we also, it is very intentional, right? Like that doesn't
Mhm,
happen by itself. You have to intentionally decide, okay, I'm going to go into the gutters,
mhm,
I'm going to go into the really hard spaces, and I'm going to look critically at myself, at our family, at um things that were done that hurt, and then understand why that happened,
mhm,
and peeling back all of those layers. is hard work. It's something that we're really intentional about in Matriarch. That's why we only allow a certain amount of people into each class to build trust, because people are not going to talk about their traumas if they don't build and find that trust. But it's happening. And
Mhm.
when you're given permission, space, and time to do that work, phenomenal things can happen. And it's beautiful, and it's messy, and it's so many things, it's so many things, but in the end, it's like ending cyclical trauma. Like,
Mhm.
this is not going to be something that my kid is going to have to deal with, because
Right.
I'm going to deal with it now. And,
Mhm.
um, and also understanding that a lot of the things that happened were also not your parents' fault. Like, they're trying to survive too.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of grace to it. There's a lot of being patient with yourself and not expecting it to happen overnight. But I think it's happening in our communities, and it's gorgeous.
Yeah. How do you oh, let's see. In my head, when you have good progress from generation to generation, um, there's almost some things that the next generation just doesn't have to worry about, where it kind of seems like, you know, uh, uh, let's see. I'm trying to think of like a good example, but how like some older generations like, well, I had to do this, but and I did this so that you don't have to do it. But they're also kind of like putting it back in your face a little bit. So how do you raise the next generation of Indigenous people, um, in a way to, I guess, be proud of how far you've come, but also not be burdened by the path that it took to get there, if
Well,
that
I
makes
think that
sense.
part of that is them understanding the accurate history of their people, right?
Hmm.
So making sure that, and for me, it's not about just Indigenous kids learning that accurate history. It's all kids should be learning that accurate history,
Right.
because I think it also makes us all more well-rounded citizens to understand your history and their history and my history. The more we can do that, the better off we are as just human beings in general.
Hmm.
But for Indigenous kids and how we raise them, Indigenous people, by and large, are oral people. We have stories that we have been telling for generations and generations and generations that are part of their understanding of who they are. And we also
Hmm.
find that when you are allowed to learn about your culture, your history, and your people, it gives you this feeling of like of who you are, who you come,
Hmm.
where you come from, and the strength of your people that is foundational to becoming who you're going to be.
Hmm.
And when you aren't given that opportunity to learn that, and you have to kind of try to form it for yourself or figure out, there are a lot of Indigenous people who have not had the opportunity to be culturally connected. We see lots of those people coming back and saying, I've
Hmm.
always felt a hole. I've always felt this loss. Like, I know there is something here that I have not been given, that is hurtful, painful for me to not have. Like, how do I get
Hmm.
this back? Reclamation is huge. But for our Indigenous kids, again, them understanding accurate information, the accurate history of their people,
Hmm.
having access to their culture. And I think it's not so much burdening them with like, I don't think it burdens them for them to understand their past. Like, I think it gives them a sense of resilience. It gives them a
Hmm.
sense of, I can do this. If my elders could do this, I can do this.
Hmm.
Knowing that they had to do a
Right.
whole lot more to survive, right? They're talking about actual survival, and we're
Right.
talking about surviving our government, or like
Right.
surviving, and I'm not trying to in any way minimize the struggles that our
Right.
people go through today, but it gives us a sense of pride about
Mhm.
where we come from. So I don't think it burdens them at all to understand what our ancestors had to go through. And it also, I think, gives them a sense of like responsibility to
Mhm.
say, if they went through all of this to make sure that I could have my language, my regalia, my culture, my traditions, it is my responsibility to continue in
Mhm.
whatever way that works for them and makes sense for them, whether that's learning the language or learning to dance or learning how to sew or bead or whatever it is. It's an important piece of identity, and it also is preservation work, and it is
Mhm.
also prevention work. We
Mhm.
see by and large when our youth are connected in some way culturally, they have reduced risks of alcoholism, drug addiction, um, MMIW rates, things like that. Everything is better when you are connected culturally. And I'm not saying it's always easy. It's
Right.
not. Lateral violence and internalized depression is a
Mhm.
real thing in any community of color or oppressed community, but it's certainly, I mean, you can't, the data doesn't lie. If you're connected culturally, you are having, by and large, a better life.
Yeah. Do you encounter people who, I guess, just feel like we should just evolve past it? Like, it's like, why are we focusing so much on the past when it's like, that was that was my ancestors, that did that, and we should, like, how do you answer to that? To, well, it wasn't me, it was them. I mean, is there? I mean,
It's such a good question, and we get that all the time. And I think that it's too bad, right? Because it's so
right,
hypocritical, right? Like we talk about like how many monuments do we have about, and rightfully so, about World War One, World War Two,
right,
about Vietnam, about World Trade Center, about
hmm,
like the list goes on, right? Like we have been
right,
having celebrations and monuments built and erected for a lot of people who didn't deserve it for a really long time. Like,
hmm,
so I think the idea, here's what I think the root is.
yeah,
And I will say this, here's an example, right?
hmm,
Native American mascots, right?
yep,
It
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
a topic that for a lot of people is like absolutely like you just spit on them if you want to take
right,
away this mascot that they love and adore.
hmm,
uh, I think it's ridiculous, but at the same time, I understand the nuances. So
uh-huh,
we was part of a team who had it's a we usually say the R word, a redskin, which is
hmm,
the flesh of a indigenous person from about here down to their neck that was taken from their body for a bounty. That's what a redskin is. A lot of people think it's like an indigenous person. No, it's a dead one, and
right.
just
I didn't know that.
yeah, it's just
Yeesh.
flesh. Because during when the British and the French were here, they actually put bounties on indigenous people, and they would pay you a really good amount of money to bring in dead Indian people. But then the bodies started stacking up and they couldn't, the stench got really bad. So instead of accepting a whole body, they would accept the
Oh,
flesh that was cut from here all the way down to about the bottom of your neck. And if you
yeah,
brought that in, that was a redskin, and they would pay you for it. So when you also understand the history and what it actually is, it's like that's ridiculous. And why is that a thing, right?
yeah. Why are we celebrating that? Like,
Why are we making it a mascot and yelling it and like
yeah,
in support of the people we love who are playing sports? It makes no sense.
you're
It's
right.
because we've romanticized the idea
Hmm,
of colonization, oppression of indigenous people, right? So
hmm,
anyway, back to the story. We were pressing this school to change their mascot.
okay.
We had for we had a listening session for the community to come in and say, hey, here's why we want to do it, here's what a redskin actually is, let's talk this out, let's talk about it. Like we want to have a forum where everybody can kind of say what they want to say. By and large, the people that had the biggest concern about this were our elder community, who were about 70-ish, 80-ish year old white men.
Yeah,
And it was because, right, these were the glory days. They remember
right.
their high school football days as like the best time of their life. And we were trying so hard to be like, you get to keep that, right? Like it's not
We're
tied
not
to this
erasing your memories. Like,
mascot. We
yeah.
just want to take this one really racist ass thing
Oh,
and change it. You get to keep your memories.
right.
And it was like, oh my gosh, it was so painful for them. They were like,
Oh,
this is our history. How can we do it? And I'm
how
like,
could you take away our history?
give
What
me my
monster would do
Redskin.
that?
Like, I'm just
Oh
like,
my
and
goodness.
this is the most low hanging fruit of all time, and we can't do this. Okay.
Yeah.
So to me, that is a very good analogy
Hmm.
of what you're talking about, right? Like, so we
Right,
have
right, right.
this romanticized version of this thing that we hold on to that has memories connected to it. It has good times connected to it. And it's hard to extrapolate the really harmful racist piece of it from these good times and memories. It's like
Hmm.
for some reason they don't feel like they can be dis
Separated. Yeah.
yes. But it's to me another piece of why racism is ingrained, right? So in
Hmm.
Oklahoma, I don't know if you've ever heard about the land runs of Oklahoma. Have you heard about that?
No.
So after the Trail of Tears and Indian relocation happened,
Yeah.
they sent them all to what was called Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma. Well, when they came here, they were like, until I think the actual treaty said something about like, as long as the grass grows and the water flows, this will be your land. And then 8 years later,
Oh.
they changed it. It's like, the grass is still growing and the water is still flowing, but
Yeah.
y'all go. And
Yeah.
so they had something called a land I think it was 7 different land runs or
Okay.
grabs or lottery systems. So they told everybody, hey, we have all this land and you can come and race for it for free. And
Oh
of
yeah, the
course,
Sooners and the yeah. Okay,
yes,
I do know a little bit
yes.
about the story. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we still have the University of Oklahoma that yells boomer sooner. And it's like, really? Okay.
Yeah.
But it's so basically um that happened, and of course for a lot of immigrant and people from poverty, this was a great deal. Did they
Right.
tell them this was actually indigenous land where people were living? No, they did not. Did
Right.
they the government just gave that land away and made it's a whole other story for another time. But anyway, this this event that happened in Oklahoma right before statehood,
Hmm.
they celebrate this land run, which is basically the genocide of indigenous people, every single year in Oklahoma public schools at about third grade. The kids get dressed up like plains people or
Yeah.
frontiersmen. They erect wagons. They do these flags with stakes. They run out on the playground field and they stake their claim in land, enacting the theft of indigenous land, reenacting every year, right? So like people
Hmm.
have these ideas in their head, like, oh, that was such a great day on the playground, and we did
Yeah.
races, picnic, and it was romanticized, right? So they're like, we want our kids to do that. That was a whole lot of fun. It's like, do you know what you're
Right.
enacting? So this
Yeah.
idea of like asking people to think critically again about like what you're doing and what is it really
Hmm.
is sadly difficult because it's
Hmm.
tied to these good memories. And so asking people to deconstruct that, I think, takes time. Like we
Hmm.
introduce the idea first, and everybody's like, oh, my way of life is coming to an end.
Right.
But then
What
it's
do you mean,
like,
my
okay,
third grader can't run out to the field?
what do you
This
mean I
is
can't sell
ridiculous.
indigenous land every year in celebration and with a picnic and a bag of chips on
Right.
Christmas, you know? And but the
Yeah.
thing is that like you plant the seed and people are going to be appalled, right? Like,
Hmm.
and then you give them time to think about it and say, okay, from an indigenous perspective, this is what this looks like. It looks like, did you know that these land runs made thousands of indigenous people homeless and they were not
Hmm.
allowed to race? Did you
Right.
know that um you just explain the pieces to it to say, consider this piece, consider this is what this was like,
Hmm.
um and give them time to think about it so that they can process and be like, you know what, that is kind of messed up, that is kind of, and hopefully when we give people grace
Hmm.
to think about it, even though it's like, oh, it's so long ago, oh, this was my ancestors, oh, this had
Right.
nothing to do with me, they can understand how they still benefit from what their ancestors did, right? And that is their responsibility. Like, how do I benefit from what happened? And how do I make this better? How do I make this right? What is my responsibility in this place that I may not
Hmm.
have personally contributed to, but I am benefiting from it in some way. And that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do better to stand in this place of privilege because my ancestor did this thing that other people still suffer from? What can I
Right.
do? Does that mean that like I deed my land back to the tribe that it belonged to when I die? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean that you're going to make dang sure that your kids understand the correct history of this place that we call America? Maybe. Does it
Mm-hmm.
mean that you're going to read a list of books for the next year with your family about Indigenous people and, Indigenous art, and just steep yourself in it? Maybe. Does it mean maybe showing up to a parade or backing up a school when they're like, we don't want this native mascot? Maybe. There are so many options and things that you can do that you don't have to feel guilt about what your ancestors do. You can feel empowerment to do something with the privilege that you benefit from it. And that's, I think, the switch we have to flip. Let go of the guilt. The guilt doesn't help anybody. The guilt's not
Right.
helping anybody. What can we do to change, to pull as a community together to amplify the things that are happening because of this horrible thing? And how can I contribute to that in a way that's not performative, that's
Mm-hmm.
real, that's lasting, that's sustainable?
Right. So patience is kind of the name of the game here.
Yes.
It's with patience. Do you ever feel like things aren't moving fast enough, or how do you balance the like we want to get stuff done, but you don't. I assume most people would want to like see the progress before they die. And if things aren't moving fast enough, you kind of get a little impatient. And how do you walk that balance of like trying to understand that things take time, but also we don't have all the time in the world?
Yeah, I do that horribly. I'm like, I'm gonna bang my head on the wall to be
Right?
like,
Like, come on, guys, it's just a mascot,
why is this molasses? Why does it
Right.
have to take eons for change? But I understand now. Okay, when I was young, it
Yeah.
was like and I'll just be really honest, I was angry about a lot of things. Like it's hard to understand the history and then not understand when other people hear it and that they don't get it right away. Like it's hard
Right.
for me to be like, hey, I'm going to tell you about this thing that's really harmful in our community, leader. I would really like you to help us, to come alongside us to do A, B, and C. And for
Mhm.
them not to like instantly get it. But as I got older, I recognized that it is hard to change, that even backwards, oppressive um things that we know about are
Yeah.
less scary than really good things that we've never experienced. Like change
Mhm.
is hard, and getting people to like move in that direction, because a lot of times people feel like it's going to oppress them to lift up another group of people. And that is just not true. This
Right.
scarcity mindset around there are only four pieces of pie. And if I give somebody a piece of the pie, that's going to be less pie for me. And it's like, that is not true. Like
Right.
the more we amplify each other and that we pull each other up and offer opportunities, like the whole community is going to benefit from that.
Right.
Everybody, including the person doing the pulling up.
Right.
Like I wish we could change that and let people see that this is good for everyone. It
Mhm.
does not make you less. It does not make you less important in any way. Does it challenge the power structure? Sure it does. But it needs to be challenged, because the way
Mhm.
that it is now keeps Black and brown bodies targeted by all kinds of police, all kinds of laws, all kinds of health disparities that shouldn't have to be that way. It shouldn't have to be that way, but it is. And so we have that responsibility to step into those places, to get uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And in that discomfort is where all the good stuff happens, right? But it's hard. And I get that. So when I was young, I was like, change. Why is change so, do it. And now I'm like, okay, there are advocates and there
Mhm.
are activists, right? And they're different
Right.
things. So advocacy has a whole lot to do with education. And
Hmm.
we have to have that education piece be a part of it from the jump. Like action one or advocacy 101 is offer the information and let them digest it. And
Hmm.
then let's have a conversation about it and all the things that we're scared about, right? And then let's
Right.
come back and say, well, what if we don't do these things, right? Activism is much more about, okay, we've had the education, we've done the work, we've done the thinking. Now we're going to talk about policy, or we're going to talk about like, how are we going to actually change this thing? Maybe we're going to have a rally, and the end point is that we're going to ask people to register to vote and go talk about this, elect leaders that are
Hmm.
going to do things to offer more access and equity to our communities. In that, I understand that change takes time, that it feels like molasses. And that is why I think that even that there are so many different ways to be advocates. There are people who do the rallies, there are people who draw the policy, there are people who share the Facebook posts, there are people who call legislators, there are people who run for office. There's that uncle at your Thanksgiving who's going to say weird stuff, but you're going to maybe challenge it, and then he's going to maybe think about it in a different way. There are so many different ways to engage
Hmm.
depending on your skill set. And I think Creator all gave us these specific gifts to do the good for all people. And that is our
Hmm.
responsibility. And not one other person has the gifts that you have specifically to do the work that you specifically have to do. So this responsibility to use these gifts for good is kind of this beautiful thing, because it makes sure that everybody is working together, right? Like if my weird uncle from Thanksgiving is left out of this opportunity, we're not going to do it all together. It's not going to be as good as it could be. So we have to find space for everybody to connect and do the work and bring
Hmm.
everybody along with us. But I will say, this next generation, I know everybody gives them a hard time. I think they're glorious. I'm like,
I
come
love the next
on,
generation. I'm so excited for what they're gonna do.
they have created language for our community that is light years away from anything my generation was doing. Like, yes, they participate in the world in a different way, and yes,
Hmm.
but can we blame them? No. Like,
Yeah.
I would participate in the world in a different way if I'd had a computer and a phone since the time that I was born.
Right.
Cannot blame them for that. Like,
Yeah.
let's embrace what they are doing, which is a lot,
Hmm.
and let them have autonomy to kind of take the wheel and go. Because I think by keeping them from that and not taking them along with us when we're writing policy, when we're going to our board meetings, when we're doing these things, we're like keeping them, from their full capacity as leaders. And it only holds us back as people.
Hmm.
So like, I'm like, make the space, bring the babies,
Yeah.
let them learn, let them speak.
Right. I think it's. I know a lot of young people think about what they can do, to help, but I don't think there's enough focus on what like the older generation can do to bring the younger generation in because they're like, well, I've been around longer and they're just new, and I think that is a good idea to bring them into certain meetings and hear their voices. Um, One thing we're doing at my church specifically is we just launched it's called Earth Care, and it's
Oh,
to
cool.
take care of, I mean, out here in Arizona, like our campus, it's a desert everywhere, like that's just a given. But our campus definitely is very deserty. It's not a brand new modern day church with turf, and I mean, this is like it was built in the 60s and 70s, like kind of in this valley. And so this Earth Care group is all about trying to take care of the land that we're on right now. We got rid of a lot of paper cups. We're using mugs, and it's kind of it's a given that Native and Indigenous people know how to take care of the land better. And what would you recommend in terms of like teaching how to take care of the land? Because that is something in terms of like the world is different than it was when we were children, and the younger generation is going to have to deal with a planet that we won't have to deal with. And is there anything that we can do to help make it a little better for them?
Yes, I think that first let me say this is not my area of expertise, but
Right.
I have lots and lots of friends who this means everything to them. And my first thought is that you learn about the land around you, right? You learn about like taking bite-sized pieces to go, okay, where am I? What
Mhm,
is the terrain? How did the indigenous people live here and what were their practices? How did they take care of things? What are the teachings around how they lived? Because by and large, all of that was ingrained into how they lived, right? Like even
mhm,
now when we're talking about the harvest of certain plants, how we always give a gift. We think about our plants and animals as our relatives. And when you change your mindset too about like, this is my relative, like how do you treat your relatives? Like what do we do with our relatives? Well, we treat them with care, respect, and love, right? We
mhm,
think about them not just right now, but in the future. We think about
mhm,
how are we going to make sure that, like, if I go and harvest something, I certainly don't harvest all of it. Like I make sure that I only take what I need and that I give a gift of some kind, whatever that is, and I am intentional about thanking my relative for this gift. And whenever you think about it like that, it seems like, would you go to your like relative and take everything? Like, no.
right.
Would you take them a gift and thank them? Yeah, you would. Would
Yeah.
you would you thank them for whatever knowledge they offered? Or, I have lots of friends who they harvest medicines, plant medicine, and then they give that to me and I always give them a gift back in return. And then understanding, where did this plant come from?
Mhm,
What is it, what is its gift to us? Does it help with congestion? Is it going to, there were lots of plant medicines that help with COVID. So just understanding the plants around you,
mhm,
learning how to care for them, learning how to use them, knowing how to share them, I think is a good way to get started. And you can always plant your own gardens. I think this using our spaces, whatever limited green space we have, whether it's a yard or it's a planters or it's, whatever it is, we have the ability to make the choice about what we're going to put in that space. Are we going to waste water with watering grass? Are we going to waste other resources to keep things looking pretty, or are we going to honor it in a way that makes sure that we're like growing a garden and we're giving those vegetables to our neighbors? We are making sure that it's something that isn't harmful to the actual environment. There are lots of trees and shrubs and flowers that are, they like the water. Now, is that something that's going to be a gift in your area? No, that's going to be something that's going to really be harmful to your area. So being thoughtful
mhm,
about how we plant, even when we're trying to make spaces look pretty, there are ways to do that that honor our terrain, the earth, and the plants that live there naturally. And I think the desert is an incredibly beautiful place. And I know people think
mhm.
about it in scarcity, but it is
Right.
a place of abundance. Like all the things that do grow and the way that they survive is just, it's beautiful. And
Mhm.
I really appreciate that question, and I can connect you to other people who would answer it better than I
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, it's
did.
yeah, I'm very excited we have this group starting because it was, they were talking about it earlier this year and they're like, "Yeah, we want to start this group to kind of help take care of the campus just better, some recycling cans here, getting a group of volunteers to help clean the trimmings and it's I was like, that's
That's
kind of
dope.
cool. That's
That is
I like
dope. I
that.
love it.
So I helped because I run the coffee shop here at the church. I helped design mugs for our contemporary service. So because I give them coffee every Sunday, so instead of paper cups, they have mugs that they wash and reuse, and it's
That's
yeah,
right on.
it's small stuff like that, and I don't know, I feel like we're doing pretty good about that.
That's
So
great.
yeah, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but where do we go from here with Indigenous Peoples Day, with learning? We talked about doing research, asking questions, getting educated. Uh, I guess what are some good next steps that we could do, not just this year, but in the next 5 to 10 years, to help bring more light on Indigenous Peoples Day?
Absolutely. I think I would love to see it become like a national holiday. So
Hmm.
anything you can do to encourage, making sure that it's recognized nationally would be a great way to support it. A lot of cities right now have to ask for it every single year in a proclamation, as opposed to something that's just, evergreen that happens no matter what. I think making sure that it's sustainable and we don't Indigenous people don't have to work hard every year to see it recognized would be a great thing. Um,
Hmm.
Again, using your privileged platforms to amplify Indigenous voices, whether that's at a Rotary meeting or at I don't know, any of the places that you are involved in where they have spaces for education. Find the nearest tribe and say, hey, is there somebody that you could send out to talk to our group? We want to be able to understand better the original peoples of this land.
Hmm.
um, Doing things like that is very low lift and helpful, and also taking the lead of the Indigenous community. What are they fighting for? What is the issues that are hurting that community, that you can be like, hey, I can help back this up. I can be there. I can show up at that rally. I can talk to my legislator to make sure that Indigenous people are being protected the way that they should be. I would say another great thing to do too is to be able to challenge the misnomers of the people in your circles that have preconceived notions about Indigenous people,
Hmm.
like the fact that we don't pay taxes, or that is not true. We pay
Right.
taxes, or that we all go to school for free. That is not a thing. Or that we all
Right.
get payments from the government. Not a thing.
Yeah.
That we are all alcoholics, or that we are all, that we all live off the government, or
Hmm.
all of these things that help oppress a people. There was a study done by Illuminatives, and I challenge everybody to go look it up. It's at illuminatives.com, and they did this study. It's the most comprehensive um, contemporary study about what people in the United States, what they think about Indigenous people. And there's a group of people in the United States that believe that we're not fully human. And then there's another group that feel like that believe that we're all extinct. And so, having the opportunity to challenge some of these things and say, no, Indigenous people are not a monolith. Their tribes are all very different.
Hmm.
They exist with us today. They contribute to our community today. And like challenging those stereotypes is something that I think all of us, not just, non-Indigenous people for Indigenous Peoples Day, but for all of our relatives, no matter where they come from and what they're about, like challenging the people in our circles who have preconceived notions that we know aren't right, challenging that in a way that meets everybody in love. Because there is
Hmm.
all a time when we did not know the truth about everything. None of us
Right.
came to this world with all the knowledge. There was somebody in our lives that took the time and the kindness to instill in us to be like, hey, like, think about this, or consider
Hmm.
this, or this is something that I want to challenge you with. So do it in a way that's kind and in love, but continue to challenge those narratives. I think that's the best thing we can do, not just for Indigenous People Day, not just for Indigenous people, but for all of our relations.
I love that. One last question. The uh, Years ago, I got rid of the term Indians out of my language because I was at a community college, and one of my friends in my class told me that was, not the correct term. Uh, just out of my curiosity, what is a correct term to call Native Americans or Indigenous people? Just in case, because I never thought about that. But
Yeah,
just so I know,
it's a
what is
great
a
question.
good term to call it?
Well, my preference is that you refer to me by my tribe. So I'm
Okay.
Choctaw. So as
Okay.
a Choctaw woman, that's my preference for how I'm identified. Now, if you don't know my tribe or
Mhm.
you don't feel comfortable asking me my tribe, Indigenous is how I like to be referred to because it is a term that both encompasses our relatives to the north of our border and the relatives to the south of our border because
Right.
we are all Indigenous people, and those borders were not created by us, right? Like
Right.
we all live together, and so it's a more inclusive term. From
Hmm.
there, my next term would be Native,
Okay.
and then it would be Native American, and
Hmm.
then it would be like Indian at that point, I guess. But that would be kind of my list of what I
Right.
would go for. If anybody ever called me a redskin, watch out, you're gonna catch some hands. Like there are things, so there's some things that I absolutely won't, but I think by and large, my favorite term, if you don't know my tribe, is Indigenous because it's
Okay.
just inclusive. And
Hmm.
our relatives to the north call them First Nations people. So we all have different words that we use to identify.
Hmm.
But those are my favorite.
Okay. Good. That's good to know. Well, thanks for talking with me today. I appreciate it, and
Absolutely.
taking the time, and I don't know how long we've been talking, but I've had a blast. So
Me too. I appreciate the time. And if you have any other questions, feel free to just to text. I'm going to be
yeah.
uh, uh, we have Indigenous Peoples Day tomorrow, and lots and
Hmm.
lots of activities here. Where I'm going to be at First Nation or First Americans Museum,
Hmm.
emceeing the Indigenous Peoples Day events tomorrow. So it'll be a fun day, and I hope your
Yeah.
community does something fun too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam, and I hope you have a really great evening.
I will. I will. You too. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.